China is winning. You've heard it. Maybe you've said it. Maybe it terrifies you. Maybe you think it's propaganda. But here's the uncomfortable truth. On several of the most important scoreboards of the 21st century, China is genuinely ahead. Not in every category, not without serious problems, and maybe not for much longer. But the Western habit of dismissing China's rise, mocking its system, and assuming America always wins in the end, that habit is becoming dangerous. Today, we're going to do something most channels won't: give China real credit where it's earned and real criticism where it's deserved. No cheerleading, no Cold War hysteria, just the uncomfortable truth from all directions. Welcome to Context Missing. Let's get into it. Let's start with the number that should have made every Western economist sit down and reconsider everything they thought they knew. In 1990, China's GDP was roughly $360 billion. The United States was at $5.9 trillion. China was 1/16th the size of the U.S. economy. Today, measured by purchasing power parity, the most accurate way to compare real economic output, China has already surpassed the United States. The IMF confirmed this. The World Bank confirmed this. China became the world's largest economy by PPP around 2016, quietly, without a press conference. On nominal GDP, the traditional measure in US dollars, China is still second, but closing fast. Most projections put China overtaking the US in nominal terms by the early 2030s. That's not a prediction from a Chinese state newspaper. That's Goldman Sachs, Bloomberg, the IMF, the people who get paid to be right about this. In one generation, roughly 35 years, China pulled off the fastest sustained economic expansion in human history. Nothing comes close. Now here's where most Western commentators make their first mistake. They say, sure, China grew, but that's just cheap labor and copying Western technology. That was true in 1995. It stopped being true around 2015, and in 2025, it's embarrassingly out of date. China now files more international patents than any other country on Earth, more than the US, more than Japan, more than Germany. In solar panel technology, China doesn't just lead, it dominates. It produces about 80% of the world's solar panels. In electric vehicles, Chinese company BYD overtook Tesla as the world's largest EV seller in 2023. That's not a typo. In high-speed rail, China has built more high-speed rail track than the rest of the world combined, over 45,000 kilometers of it. In 5G infrastructure, China deployed more 5G base stations in a single year than the US has deployed in total. In artificial intelligence research, China produces more peer-reviewed AI papers than any other country, quantity and, increasingly, quality. This is not a developing country copying Western homework anymore. This is a technological competitor, in some areas, a leader. Let's talk about Belt and Road, because this is where China's soft power strategy becomes impossible to ignore. Launched in 2013 by Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative is the most ambitious infrastructure program in human history. China has invested, depending on how you count, somewhere between $600 billion and $1 trillion in infrastructure across 140-plus countries. Ports in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Greece, railways in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Laos, highways across Central Asia, bridges in Eastern Europe. The Western critique is that this is debt-trap diplomacy. China lends money, countries can't repay, China takes strategic assets. That critique has some validity. The case of Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, leased to China for 99 years after debt default, is real and alarming. But here's what the debt trap narrative misses. Most BRI recipient countries don't feel trapped. They feel developed. When Western donors attached democracy conditions to their aid, China showed up and built the road, no questions asked. For governments across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, China offered something the West hadn't in decades: infrastructure without lectures. You can call that cynical. Many leaders in the global South call it practical, and their vote in international institutions increasingly reflects it. Here's a stat that illustrates China's global diplomatic shift better than anything else. At the United Nations, when votes come up on human rights resolutions criticizing China, the majority of the world's countries either abstain or vote with Beijing. Not because they love authoritarianism, but because China has spent 20 years building relationships, funding projects, and showing up, while the West was distracted by its own crises. In 2023, China brokered a diplomatic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two bitter rivals that the U.S. had failed to bring together for decades. China did it in Beijing, in 4 days, and announced it to a stunned world. Whatever you think of the deal's durability, the symbolism was devastating. The world's new deal maker isn't Washington, it might be Beijing. This is the soft power shift that doesn't make headlines in the West, but is reshaping how two-thirds of humanity thinks about global leadership. Now, let's talk about the thing that makes China's rise most uncomfortable for Western democracies to process: the system question. For 70 years, the Western assumption was that economic development leads inevitably to democracy. Get rich enough and you demand political freedom. It's inevitable. China has spent the last 40 years methodically disproving this theory. China got rich, very rich, and instead of democratizing, it built the most sophisticated authoritarian system the world has ever seen. Digital surveillance at a scale that would make Orwell faint, social credit systems, AI-powered predictive policing, a firewall blocking the entire global internet. And yet, and this is the part that makes Western political scientists deeply uncomfortable, the Chinese government retains genuine popular support. Multiple independent surveys, including the Edelman Trust Barometer and Harvard's Ash Center research, have found that Chinese citizens trust their government at rates that dwarf Western democracies to far. Now, is that because the system is genuinely popular, or because dissent is suppressed so effectively that unhappy people don't show up in surveys? Probably both, and that ambiguity is exactly the problem. The Western model assumed unhappy people would eventually force change. China has made unhappy people invisible. That's not admirable, but it is effective, and effectiveness in geopolitics counts for a lot. Let's talk about the area where China is winning most decisively and where the West is most in denial: the green energy transition. The world needs to move away from fossil fuels. Every credible climate scientist agrees on this. The question is, who builds the infrastructure for what comes next? China has decided, for a mix of strategic, economic, and environmental reasons, that it will dominate clean energy manufacturing, and it is succeeding beyond anyone's projections. Chinese solar panels are so cheap, they've made solar power the cheapest electricity source in history. Cheaper than coal, cheaper than gas, cheaper than nuclear. Chinese EV batteries, dominated by CATL, power vehicles around the world. CATL has over 35% of the global EV battery market. Chinese wind turbine manufacturers are undercutting Western competitors by 30 to 50% on price. The economics are simply not competitive. The West's response has been tariffs, blocking cheap Chinese clean energy products to protect domestic industries. There's a strategic logic to that. But here's the uncomfortable implication: Western tariffs on Chinese solar panels mean the green transition happens slower and costs more. We are literally choosing to slow down climate action to avoid being dependent on China. That is the trade-off being made, in your name, right now. China isn't just winning the clean energy race, it has lapped the field, and the West is still arguing about whether to get off the starting blocks. Okay, we've given China a lot of credit. Now let's talk about the cracks, because they are real, they are serious, and some of them are potentially fatal. The first and most urgent: demographics. China is aging at a speed that should terrify its leadership. Decades of the one-child policy created a demographic time bomb. China's population peaked in 2022 and is now declining. By 2050, projections suggest China will have more people over 60 than the entire current population of the United States. A shrinking, aging workforce supporting a vast elderly population while trying to maintain economic growth. This is an almost impossible equation. Japan tried to manage this and has spent 3 decades in economic stagnation. China will face the same challenge, but at a much larger scale and before it has fully become rich. There's a phrase economists use: China may grow old before it grows rich. That is not a slogan, it is a genuine existential risk to the Chinese economic model. The second crack, the property crisis, and this one is already happening, right now in slow motion. For decades, China's economy was turbocharged by real estate development. At its peak, property and property related industries accounted for roughly 25 to 30% of Chinese GDP. Evergrande, once China's largest property developer, collapsed under $300 billion in debt in 2021. It was one of the largest corporate collapses in history. But Evergrande wasn't alone. Country Garden, Sunac, Kaisa, one after another, China's biggest developers hit the wall. Millions of Chinese families had paid for apartments that were never finished, their life savings locked in concrete shells in empty cities. The Chinese government has been managing this crisis carefully, preventing a sudden crash but unable to fully resolve it. The deeper problem is structural. China built its middle class on rising property values. Now those values are falling, and middle class confidence is falling with them. An economy that loses its middle class's confidence doesn't just slow down, it can spiral. Ask Japan. Ask the US in 2008. The third crack, and the most politically sensitive, innovation under authoritarianism has a ceiling. China files patents. China builds infrastructure. China produces engineers by the millions, all true. But the most transformative innovations in human history, the internet, the smartphone, social media, mRNA vaccines, came from open societies. They came from environments where researchers could publish freely, challenge authority, fail publicly, and build on each other's work across borders. China's system is extraordinarily good at execution, at scaling proven technologies, at building faster and cheaper than anyone else. But genuine, disruptive, paradigm-shifting innovation, the kind that creates entirely new industries, requires a culture of questioning and risk that authoritarianism structurally suppresses. When a Chinese scientist publishes research that contradicts Communist Party policy, as happened with early COVID-19 data, they disappear, literally. When Jack Ma, China's most successful entrepreneur, gave a speech mildly criticizing regulators in 2020, he vanished from public life for 3 months. What message does that send to every Chinese entrepreneur, researcher, and risk taker? Play it safe. Don't rock the boat. Don't be the nail that sticks up. That culture doesn't produce the next Google. It doesn't produce the next mRNA breakthrough. And China knows it, which is why it's watching its AI sector nervously. The fourth crack. China has almost no real allies. And in geopolitics, that matters enormously. Russia calls itself China's partner, but Russia is now a sanctioned, isolated pariah, more dependent on China than the reverse. That's not an alliance, that's a client relationship. North Korea is technically an ally. That tells you something about the quality of China's alliance portfolio. Pakistan is close, but Pakistan is economically fragile, politically unstable, and consumed by its own crises. Meanwhile, the United States has NATO, 32 countries. It has treaty alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. The U.S. alliance system represents roughly 50% of global GDP. China's partners represent a fraction of that. When China faces a crisis, economic, military, or diplomatic, it largely faces it alone. That is a profound strategic vulnerability that China's GDP numbers don't capture. The fifth crack, and perhaps the deepest, Taiwan and the trap Xi Jinping has set for himself. Xi Jinping has made reunification with Taiwan a central pillar of his legacy. He has said it cannot be delayed indefinitely. But a military invasion of Taiwan would be catastrophic for China, even if it succeeded. The economic sanctions that would follow would make Russia's post-Ukraine isolation look mild. China's export-dependent economy would be devastated. The global backlash would push fence-sitting nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America firmly toward the Western camp. And the invasion might not even succeed. The Taiwan Strait is a brutal crossing, Taiwan's defenses are significant, and U.S. involvement is a real possibility. Xi has boxed himself in. Backing down on Taiwan looks weak domestically. Moving on Taiwan risks economic catastrophe internationally. There is no clean exit from the box he's built, and the longer he waits, the more Taiwan arms itself, and the harder the box becomes to escape. Let's zoom out and ask the bigger question. What does winning actually mean in the 21st century? If winning means GDP size, China is arguably already there or will be shortly. If winning means technological leadership, it depends on the sector. Renewables and manufacturing, China wins. Semiconductors and AI software, still contested. If winning means global influence, China has made enormous gains, but the U.S. alliance network still outweighs China's relationships by almost every measure. If winning means quality of life for citizens, this is where China's authoritarian model faces its most serious challenge. GDP per capita in China is roughly $13,000. In the United States, it's over $80,000. The average Chinese citizen is still 6 times poorer than the average American. China's middle class is real and growing, but hundreds of millions of rural Chinese still live in conditions that would shock most Western observers. Winning a geopolitical competition while your own people remain relatively poor is a precarious kind of victory. History is full of empires that learned this lesson too late. Here's the comparison that most Western analysts refuse to make because it's uncomfortable from both directions. The United States, in the same period China has been rising, has been busy. It invaded Iraq based on intelligence it knew was questionable, killing hundreds of thousands of people and destabilizing an entire region. It allowed its financial system to blow up the global economy in 2008 and then bailed out the banks while ordinary people lost their homes. It watched its infrastructure crumble, its life expectancy fall, its political system gridlock, and its public trust in institutions collapse. While China was building 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, the U.S. couldn't finish one high-speed rail line between Los Angeles and San Francisco. While China lifted 800 million people out of poverty, the single greatest poverty reduction in human history, U.S. poverty rates have barely moved. I'm not saying China's system is better. I'm saying the competition isn't between a perfect system and a flawed one. It's between two flawed systems, one of which has been more focused. So why is China winning? Where it is winning? Let me give you the real answer, not the flattering one, the uncomfortable one. China is winning because it makes long-term decisions. The West makes short-term ones. Chinese leadership thinks in decades. Western governments think in election cycles, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years at most. When China decided to dominate solar panels, it subsidized the industry for 15 years before it became globally competitive. No Western democracy could sustain that politically. When China decided to build high-speed rail, it built it, regardless of political opposition, regardless of short-term cost. The trains run today. When China decided to invest in Africa, it sent engineers and built roads for 20 years before expecting geopolitical returns. The returns are now arriving. Western democracies are structurally incapable of this kind of patience because voters demand results before the next election and politicians comply. This is not an argument for authoritarianism. Authoritarianism makes catastrophic long-term decisions too, the one-child policy being Exhibit A. But it is an argument that democracy has a structural weakness in strategic competition, and pretending otherwise is not patriotism, it's delusion. Here's another uncomfortable truth. China is winning partly because the West taught it how. Western companies moved manufacturing to China for cheap labor and transferred technology in the process. Western universities trained hundreds of thousands of Chinese engineers, scientists, and economists, many of whom returned home. Western investment banks helped Chinese companies list on global markets and access global capital. Western consumers bought Chinese goods for decades, funding the very industrial capacity that now competes with Western industries. The West didn't just watch China rise, it actively participated in financing it because the short-term profits were too good to resist. Now, Western governments are imposing tariffs and export controls, trying to close the door after the knowledge has already left the building. This is not China being devious. This is the West being short-sighted and now paying the price for 30 years of prioritizing quarterly earnings over strategic thinking. So, where does this leave us? What's the honest assessment? China is a genuine great power, not a developing country, not a paper tiger, not a house of cards about to collapse. It has real strengths: scale, manufacturing, infrastructure, long term planning, and a government willing to make hard bets. It also has real, potentially fatal weaknesses: demographics, property debt, innovation ceilings, geopolitical isolation, and a Taiwan problem with no clean solution. The West has real strengths too: alliance networks, institutional trust, rule of law, genuine innovation culture, and demographic advantages through immigration. But the West also has serious weaknesses: short termism, political gridlock, crumbling infrastructure, and a dangerous habit of underestimating China because underestimating China is more comfortable. The world isn't choosing between a perfect system and a flawed one. It's watching two deeply imperfect systems compete, and the outcome is not predetermined. The most dangerous thing you can believe right now is that this competition is already over, in either direction. If you think China has already won, you're ignoring its genuine and serious vulnerabilities. If you think China is about to collapse, you're ignoring 40 years of evidence that it keeps defying Western predictions of its demise. The honest position is this: China is a formidable competitor that has earned its place at the top table through genuine effort, genuine sacrifice, and genuine strategic discipline. And it is also a system with structural weaknesses that could, under the wrong circumstances, unravel faster than anyone expects. Understanding both of those things simultaneously, without defaulting to either cheerleading or dismissal, that's what serious analysis looks like. And right now, in a world drowning in hot takes and propaganda from all directions, serious analysis is exactly what's been missing. If this changed how you think about China, the West, or what winning actually means, subscribe, share, and tell me in the comments where you think I got it wrong. See you next time.